And thank you, and it's especially nice to renew our friendship, as you say, although your introduction reminds me that, if you didn't notice, the Government of Canada is one of those very committed to the Peter principle, because they do promote people to the level of our incompetence. So I apologize in advance if I'm not keeping up to the level you would expect at such an erudite conference. I think Nick and Judith had in mind some comic relief tonight because they've asked, according to Patrick Lowe, a powerless nobody, isolated from within a Geneva bubble, to offer you some perspectives. And worse still, when I served as G7 finance deputy, and it was at a time when my counterparts were Mario Draghi from Italy, Haruhiko Kuroda from Japan, Tim Geithner from the US, and a few others. I banned all Greek equations from any memos coming to me. And I did that deliberately because I said, if it couldn't be written in a style that I could read and comprehend, then no minister is actually going to follow through and take the public policy advice. So it's got to be put in user-friendly form. So I learned a tremendous amount today, even if some of it was over my head. But I thought what might be most useful following today's discussions and as a foundation for tomorrow is to give you a bit of a reality check from Geneva on three things. First, what is the actual agenda at the WTO and what are the prospects for moving forward? Second, to put that into the context, particularly of development and a bit of growth. And third, and finally, to say what does that mean going forward for the future agenda and what that might mean for you in the public policy community. So let me begin simply by reconfirming what many of you have highlighted in the course of the day, which is trade has been underwhelming in its performance of late. Chart on the left is straightforward. We're about 20% below the average trend in the pre-crisis period. And the chart on the right is a pretty simple graphic depiction of what's changed, and we've heard a lot about what's changed since the start of the Doha negotiations in 2001. Where the share of world trade taken by emerging markets has grown considerably. I think Kamal in particular highlighted that fact, and most of it accounted for by China and the BRICS, contrasted against the declining shares owned by the EU, US, and Japan. What that tells us on both sides is if the world's struggling to recreate private demand and to wean itself from easy money through quantitative easing, trade is a necessary contributor because trade historically has outpaced GDP. But if we're going to get trade going again, it's all the more essential that the major emerging markets are equally participating in making that happen. We've heard a lot about Bali, and Bernard did a masterful job of focusing in particular on the trade facilitation agreement, but there's a tendency, at least in much of academia and the media, to say, okay, trade facilitation, other than that, nothing happened. Let me remind you that actually quite a bit happened. 11 different ministerial decisions, 19 sets of directions in all. Bali itself was a mini package comprising not only trade facilitation, but agriculture and development dimensions. Agriculture, it's not just a free pass for India, it's an acknowledgement that food security does matter to the poorest of the poor. Food security does not equal food self-sufficiency. Can we come up with rules that on the one hand actually foster food security and on the other don't distort trade? Ministers said you shall develop a solution to that problem. You shall implement, and this was highlighted I think in David's presentation, improve the transparency in the administration of TRQs in agricultural products so as to minimize the distortion to trade. And yes, we really did promise in Hong Kong to get rid of agricultural export subsidies and export credits, and this time we really mean it, so get going on that. A package of development-related issues, a monitoring mechanism for the first time made operational to say if we allowed for special and differential treatment, have we done it in a way that actually works? Ministers said, and you shall come up with, in effect, an MFN plus opportunity for least developed countries to expand their services exports. And let's see if you can operationalize a set of guidelines that are more liberal in terms of rules of origin for least developed countries. And in 2014, please undertake a comprehensive review of aid for trade. And again, Bernard highlighted, I think, some interesting challenges as to what is actually aid for trade. Plus the ongoing regular work of the organizations. And for an organization that supposedly is failing, interestingly enough, there are 24 more countries in line to join the organization, including Afghanistan, Kazakhstan, Bosnia, Herzegovina, and 9 more LDCs. There's an ongoing horizontal work program on electronic commerce to examine what doing business in the digital economy actually means. And for those who are not aficionados, NVNI stands for non-violation, nullification, and impairment, which is an interesting theological debate as to whether it actually relates to intellectual property disciplines or not. All of this to say, without going into detail on this agenda, that there's quite a bit going on in Geneva, quite a bit more than trade facilitation, with or without Doha dead, dying, or dormant. Ministers said, take 2014, build on trade facilitation as a foundation, and put together a meaningful work program to complete Bali. And if you do that in 2014, you've got 12 months. We're going to meet again at the end of 2015. You've got another year to negotiate. At the core, and Tim Josling emphasized this, I think it deserves more emphasis, at the core is agriculture as the biggest part of unfinished business from successive rounds of negotiation. If you can achieve some level of ambition in agriculture, particularly for market access, you will be able and must be able to build around it non-agricultural market access. And frankly, previous negotiations have shown that if you do that, you have to have something to balance it in services. It is a market access focused challenge we have to put together. If these 3 pillars do come together in a robust way, then you end up adding whatever tidying up you may need to do, or incremental improvements in rules, potentially on trade and the environment, potentially on TRIPS, and the long outstanding dispute settlement review. All of which, and potentially, given e-commerce, you may be able to include some new issues around that. And you have, in effect, Doha, if not Doha plus, all of which needs to be infused with the development dimension, given the preponderant nearly 100 developing and least developed country members of this universal organization. Conversely, if your ambition becomes too modest on agriculture and you do only tiny things, then frankly, the whole package is going to be small. So very stark choices facing global trade negotiators. It's not quite go for broke, but the potential with Bali as a foundation is to actually do a very significant market access package that comprises, as I said, agriculture, NAMA, and services. But I did say agriculture is at the core. Agriculture itself will have to be comprehensive. It will have to address domestic support, It will have to address the long outstanding question of export subsidies and export credits, which we heard about today, and meaningful market access. Why is agriculture at the center when it only accounts for about 10 to 12% of the global economy? Well, frankly, if you look back, and my statistics may not be completely accurate, but the FAO reports that over the last 4 decades, the developing countries' share of agricultural exports dropped from 40% to 25%. By the early 90s, it's climbed back up a bit thanks to commodity prices going up to about 30%. But that means most all developing countries feel they're losing on agriculture and continue to lose, and that the system is stacked against them. Most countries in the world have a deficit in food trade. And only Latin America as a region has a surplus. Even most high-income East Asians, of course, are net food importers. Same for West Asia, same for North Africa. And the G20, the agriculture G20 voice that you heard about earlier today, formed at Cancun, actually accounts for 60% of the world's population, 70% of the world's farmers, and 26% of all agricultural exports. That's a pretty strong lobby and constituency to make agriculture central. Domestic support, the US and EU have gradually been coming down and have gradually been cleaner in the way they offer support, more in the so-called green box than in amber, although the new US Farm Bill opens the possibility of more amber box support in the future. At the same time, in pure dollar terms, the volume of subsidization and support domestically by China, India, Brazil has risen hugely. They will continue to say, but wait a minute, we're developing countries, we get special treatment. China says we paid at the office, but the time we exceeded. The United States and Europe and the Cairns Group saying, no, the world has changed. Major challenges on domestic support. Export competition, there too, it tends to be, all right, US, EU, down about 50% in terms of their use of these things, but will they be prepared to bind it at that level versus what do they get in return in terms of domestic support and market access? Market access, because of what we heard, with no tariffs having been bound at their applied level, it's not going to be enough just to get countries to agree to bind their current applied tariff. That's, in effect, giving away water. People want blood beyond the water and want genuine reductions from the current applied tariff level. So it's not as if there's an easy path forward, but what there is a willingness and a palpable difference in the level of engagement and the willingness to think freely beyond where we were stalemated in 2008 and 2011 to see if this can be put together. I would say, to be very frank, in this pre-election period, the only country that has been completely defensive and not willing to engage so far is India. If you have to combine that with non-agricultural market access, we left off with a very complicated formula with flexibilities and sectorals and some non-tariff barriers, but that's been stalled since 2011. And that formula got stalled in part because the modalities really, again, didn't quite get meaningful access into developing country markets. Thus far, people, again, are constructively engaged, but have no silver bullet to figure out, do we need a universal formula? Should we go with sectoral agreements on products that matter? Shall we factor in the reality of global supply chains? And how do you apply, again, I'm repeating the message here, the change in the world economy if you look at who is large today and who will be large by 2050. The most common sense approach is you test the political appetite of major countries saying, well, at the end of the day, what could you live with? And then with all of your advice as professional economists, you do some reverse engineering and say, please invent us a formula and flexibilities and a set of modalities that will produce that result instead of spending half the year looking at those equations that I try and ban. And add services to that. Most people would say your level of achievement and your level of ambition in services will be defined in advance by how much you find an appetite for in agriculture and in goods. The most likely way this will unfold is for people to come forward in a fairly straightforward fashion, the way they used to negotiate goods, and say, this is what I'd like to have in your market as a principal supplier. You get the response and you begin to package together a set of market access results in services. There are other pillars, including on rules. I think the current read is you're not going to get too much on the rules front, that if services does result, it's going to tend to be on a market access basis. And we've got, as I mentioned in the outer circle, some miscellaneous elements. Some people would love to get an anti-dump countervail. I was at Seattle. Canada was responsible for coordinating consultations on anti-dumping. And on the second last day, we reported back to the plenary that indeed the consensus was 134-1 of the need to amend the anti-dumping code, which of course meant it couldn't go anywhere. I wouldn't be surprised if the consultations produced something similar this time around. A very interesting new set of questions, and I didn't hear this mentioned today on intellectual property because with the signing of the Nagoya Protocol, the relationship between intellectual property on the one hand and the Convention on Biological Diversity and the respect for traditional knowledge and the respect for natural products is yet to be defined in either agreement. And there have been calls to factor that in. I'll come back to development. Environmental goods, you heard a little bit about. This is an APEC initiative. Right now we're at a list of 54 specific products where there's an APEC agreement to go down to 5% maximum. We'd like to go to 0, and we'd like to multilateralize it to the world. China, a full participant in that effort. Dispute settlement reform stalled for about 20 years, but as we've heard, we haven't suffered too much. I'm not going to talk about TTIP or TPP, but I will talk about WTO-related plurilaterals, and I know we're using the term in various ways here. The ITA, about 70% of trade in information technology products wasn't even invented at the time of the first ITA. So we're talking about a list of products in today's economy. China is now both the largest producer, largest exporter, and largest importer of such products. The critical mass one would need to do it on an MFN basis has to include China in a meaningful way. You've got over 24 other countries willing to move. China is yet to indicate enough of its products onto the list that give us yet confidence that this can be done, but it should be done this year. Environmental goods I just talked about. Government procurement agreement, standalone, separate. We've revised it, and it's just come into force as a revised agreement. Broader coverage, more countries. They estimate anywhere from $2 to $20 billion added to global growth opportunities. Trade and services agreement, we're now pretty well set with the framework. We're now moving to the hard negotiating stage of offers and requests. In my view, it should serve not as competition for, but as a catalyst for services discussions at the WTO table. China has indicated some interest in coming to the TISA table, but is yet to indicate with what spirit and with what level of ambition. So they're not yet at the table. To answer a question raised earlier in the day, my guess, and it's purely a personal read, so please don't quote or attribute, is that the most likely outcome is TISA will become an Article 5, in effect, FTA for services agreement. GATT's Article 5 is the same as GATT Article 24. Not as if we don't have some challenges. The red on the map shows who's got elections this year. So South Africa, India, EU Parliament, Brazil, not to mention the US midterms and so on. This obviously could put quite a constraint on countries' willingness to set out ambition pre-election. We'll know a little better, I guess, from India, at least as of July. Indonesia, one shouldn't underestimate the impact of their elections either. But what we do have, and I'm repeating myself, is a palpable change in tone. Instead of saying, oh, it's dead and trade facilitation was all we can do and we're back to the same old, the level of engagement, the openness to new ideas, new approaches is something that's quite palpable. Let me turn to that horizontal arrow that cut through all my concentric circles on development. And I've got to say that it is fundamentally important for the North to appreciate just how central the development dimension is. The chart is an interesting one. It shows the increasing proportion of negotiating issues that are specific to developing countries and LDCs. So we're moving in opposite direction here, beginning with the LDC. It's not chronological, it's pure volume. So the Doha agenda on the left. So it means that we're going to be challenged to come up either with a willingness to accept special and differential treatment, enhanced flexibilities in almost every single negotiating area. In agriculture, for example, as I mentioned at the outset, developing countries want significant reductions in trade-distorting domestic support by developed countries, as well as the elimination of export subsidies, because they're viewed as checks on the growth of the agriculture sector. So you combine that with Bernard's highlighting of the fact that in the trade facilitation agreement we have a new model that in effect says you want us engaged, you're going to have to give us some capacity building in return, moral or legal commitment. So there's every possibility of having to ask ourselves, well, if we want this kind of reform and discipline and reduction of subsidies on agriculture, how are we actually going to help you get there and sustain your farmers in the meantime, and are we prepared through other institutions and through donor coordination to provide the technical assistance to do so? The silver lining is the flip side that I tried to highlight in my comment on trade facilitation this afternoon, which is ultimately it's a remarkably creative model, because it does, instead of giving countries a permanent out or excuse to avoid obligation, in effect draw them into committing to get to the same level of obligation. We have to address how to deliver aid for trade, with all respect to the World Bank that has claimed to know aid for trade and how to do it right for a long time. But as we heard, even on something as focused as trade facilitation, is it just teaching people how to administer a customs service? Is it the physical infrastructure that goes with it? Is it the economic adjustment that's going to be needed if certain professions and certain activities are going to be open to competition? Or is it building the productive capacity? You look at the allocation of aid monies and you can see, frankly, that in building productive capacity, all of the emphasis has largely been on developing agriculture, fish, and forestry. And yes, that's key to developing country growth, but we're not really focusing as much as we might on business sectors and other trade-related sectors that would build a better structure in the domestic economy for more sustainable growth, let alone simple doing business report related type issues like stabilizing the business environment, improving basic skills and apprenticeships for participation in the labor force, addressing corruption. So we really do need more thinking and advice on how to align trade and aid in a manner that actually facilitates development. Which is a nice segue into the second theme I wanted to talk about, because frankly, thanks to the education Anne provided me, thanks to my time at the fund, thanks to my time in an integrated Ministry of Trade, Foreign Affairs and Development, I've come to learn that all the free trade in the world will do absolutely zilch for development unless it's accompanied by the other conditions necessary to sustain growth. And that begins with good economic governance. It begins with ensuring that you actually have what I call the enabling sectors, the backbone sectors that need to provide the infrastructure for doing business in any other sector: energy, transport, communications, and a financial sector that's functioning and that can provide credit. It needs to have support from producing people that can participate in the labor force, and it needs to have physical infrastructure. I know there's a huge debate among you economists as to whether there is a causal relationship between trade openness and growth, and the jury's out on that, and empirical studies have pointed both ways. But it is an interesting chart to contrast Panama and Peru on the one hand with Argentina and Venezuela on the other. And one can draw some conclusions as to what are the factors that have contributed to that. It's not just trade openness, but it's trade openness along with sound economic policies at home that help to foster a permanent climate of structural reform and a business-friendly environment. Secondly, you better have your books in order. Your debt better be on a sustainable path. You better have budgeting that doesn't tax the heck out of your economy, that keeps enough money available for productive purposes, that you're not manipulating your exchange rate, and we can have a whole separate conference, of course, on currency manipulation, and that your central bank, therefore, knows what it's doing as well. What that says is, again, we alone at the WTO won't succeed unless we're working more or less in sync with what the IMF is advising and what is being implemented by way of ensuring sound economic policies, and particularly macro and particularly monetary policies that doesn't aggravate the sustained global imbalances that remain, as the chart on the right shows. The WTO doesn't have the remit, doesn't have the expertise, doesn't have the literacy to address these issues, but for God's sakes, we've got to learn to talk to each other, and there's a huge divide that remains between Washington on both sides of 18th Street and Geneva on these issues. There is a window of opportunity, and I encourage you to pay closer attention this year than you might otherwise to the other G20 chaired by Australia this year, because Australia, instead of repeating by rote the one line that's going to say, and we support concluding Doha as soon as possible for the 14th straight year, is actually trying to focus each of the member countries on what's going to enhance growth. And we're going to see this year collectively if we can adopt a collective G20 target to increase growth across G20 economies by 2 percentage points in the next 5 years. There are two streams of officials that are trying to help leaders get ready for that. The traditional G20 finance deputies, which I used to chair, before it became a leaders session, is inviting each country to submit its own growth strategy. Here's my strategy. It's not uniform for everybody. And to provide, in effect, peer review from the other 18, and as you know, the G20 is only 19, because finance ministers can't count, but it's actually not that, it's because the EU has to have its own seat, which it shares with the ECB. But it's in effect peer review by which other experts at very senior levels is going to offer some advice on some further structural reforms, job-creating avenues that might actually enhance the growth strategy. The Sherpas, which are a mix of foreign policy, commercial, trade people, have been specifically directed to integrate a trade liberalization component to that, to feed back into each country's comprehensive growth strategy. And Australia, being Australia, loyal to multilateralism, chair of the Cairns Group on the one hand, active in TPP and bilateral FTAs on the other, does want to have some discussion on how to help foster convergence between the regionals, mega-regionals, and the multilateral system. So it's actually a very substantive, aggressive, and ambitious agenda that can help reinforce what's going on in Geneva. That then leads me to a nice transition to the third topic I wanted to talk to you about, which is what does this mean for the future agenda? People think, thanks to the baggage the MAI carries, we're never going to get back to investment. Frankly, the tide is turning completely back to the need to address investment. UNCTAD, you would think the voice of the developing countries resistant to multinationals that originally had the equitable principles of restricted business practices, the new international economic order. UNCTAD itself is an advocate for international investment liberalization today. We know, and developing countries themselves know, that 80% of world trade is linked to the production of multinational firms. It's estimated now, and I don't think anybody highlighted this today, but about 40% of world trade today is intermediate goods. 40% of everything that crosses the border feeds into another product. As Pascal Lamy said, that is ultimately made in the world. And that means you've got to join one of these chains, which means you've got to attract enough investment to participate in that chain. And that takes you back to what I was saying earlier about combining your openness to trade and investment with an enabling environment that's attractive enough for countries to make that investment in your economy. And we see FDI pretty well split 50-50 between developed and developing. Some of you might say, well, that's totally distorted because it's all China. Well, not quite. Of the 52% going to emerging markets, China 17%, Brazil 9%, India 4%, Asia overall about 58% of that 52%. BRICS of the entire total of 100%, about 20% of all investment of 2012, the last for which we have full numbers. This is a chart I more or less borrowed from Bernard, but in a slightly different format to talk about intermediate goods. This is in effect the import content of exports. The Swedish Confederation of Industry, I think, first coined the word servification of trade. What does that mean? The simple, and Patrick's working on some very serious study on this too, any movement of any good, take your ordinary widget that moves across the border, carries with it a huge value added in services. The transportation service, the financial services that made it possible, the lawyers and accountants that made the contracts to make that buyer and seller come together. We don't know how to measure it. We certainly don't integrate that in our silos of negotiations that treat goods separately from services. So that means, frankly, there's a huge opportunity if we get through the next 2 years, which was my first section, to frame a new set of negotiations and a new trade agenda that deals with things on a value chain basis. So investment, value chains. Let me highlight 3 other big challenges. Trade in the environment comes up in various different ways. We've seen, thanks to certain Canadian policies, some interest in what can be subsidized, what not, with what local content for renewable energy, and what remedies one might have against that. Rare earths raises some interesting questions on extractive industries and sovereignty over natural resources. Huge questions. And maybe we need to frame our discussion in a very different way to get beyond just environmental goods, to get at these issues. And I mentioned earlier the Convention on Biological Diversity. Digital economy. I got to admit, I've been sold on this by having more than one conversation with eBay and Alibaba and PayPal. Take your ordinary farming family in the middle of Africa. Regrettably, unfortunately, the woman's probably out working the fields and carrying the water. Maybe the husband's at home carving something very artisanal for about 10 cents. That piece of art can be posted on eBay, and within a week that person could be selling to 70 different countries as a major exporter, all for the cost of 10 cents. If we do anything to facilitate that family's access to the internet, ability to price, ability to actually engage in a financial service and transaction, provide any notion of consumer protection, so that the person sitting in Palo Alto who buys it knows what to do if it arrives in defective fashion. Provide facilitated transportation, anything approaching net neutrality to guarantee this kinds of access. And let's face it, absolutely none of today's GATT WTO rules have anything to do with that framing of what an international transaction looks like. And those are the SMEs of the future. And that's hundreds of millions of people who actually would be exporters and would be traders if we think about what it means to connect buyer and seller in the digital economy. And then you have the add-on dimensions of privacy, data flows, Bitcoin and the digital currency, and so on. Huge challenges intellectually in coming to grips with this. eBay and a few others are putting good minds to work on this, but I haven't seen as much academic, scholarly literature moving ahead. And although we're hearing about this in TPP, we're not quite sure how meaningful the disciplines might be, but have we really addressed what's different about state capital and private capital? Does it matter if it's Temasek or CNOC that's buying a shale property than Exxon or otherwise? Is there something different about corporate decision-making, about potential political factors going into such decision-making by state-owned enterprises than by private capital? That arose a bit in Dubai ports here in the United States, but hasn't really been pursued. And is there a difference between corporate forms and sovereign wealth funds, which supposedly are just investment vehicles? And if there is a concern or potential abuse, what's your remedy? Should they just be looked at as subsidy issues or as something different? Again, we're missing, I think, careful thought and analysis on these issues. So, you guys got to have dessert. I'm anxious to do so too. Let me wrap up by trying to offset some of David Gantz's cynicism and pessimism from this afternoon by saying, you know, we are actually tasting some improved prospects and some improved appetite to at least give it a go in Geneva to build on the trade facilitation anchored mini package of Bali to see if we can have a market access package that would allow us to declare Doha done. And we've got 2 years to do that, and we're very aware of the timetable. But even that really doesn't address the massive challenge of inequality in the world, of creating jobs in this jobless recovery, because we've got to get the rest of the 6 billion today and the 9 billion people in the world tomorrow creating more wealth for more social good. And we're only going to do that if we get trade and macro and structural reforms moving in sync and with the right sequencing. And that means we've got to figure out what used to be called a coherence agenda, and I know somebody said that was a bad word today. It's not, if we can figure out how the organizations of jurisdiction, to borrow a lawyer's phrase, WTO on trade, which shouldn't be doing macro, IMF, which needs to understand trade, as we learned during the Asian crisis, and when it didn't, and told Indonesia how to raise its tariffs when WTO demanded that they lower tariffs, are talking to each other. Because ultimately what we are trying to do is make people's lives better. And frankly, as a mere practitioner in the trenches, as a powerless nobody, we desperately need your help. I know none of you are bought and paid for. All of you are fiercely independent in your chosen areas for research. There are some of us who have a huge appetite and a huge need for people to think for us and to think ahead of us. I've tried to give you some flavor of issues that in my limited scan are yet to be meaningfully addressed in the public policy community. I think there's lots of work here that should entice you to think about your next major set of projects. Unfortunately, given the jobless recovery and given how much money we had to print, we in government have no money to actually commission you to do this. But I still think it will be very much worthwhile, and what we will do in drawing on your wisdom should give you more than satisfactory spiritual returns. So thank you very much, and have a good evening.
Thank you, Jonathan. I did persuade him, even though he's very hungry, to take a few questions. So who wants to ask him anything to raise any issues?
Of course, Patrick first.
Okay, Patrick first.
Jonathan, if you ever decide to stand for Director General, I volunteer my services as a member of your promotional team. The only thing I wanted to say, which worried me a little bit about the early part of your presentation, was that I think you gave too much weight, too much airtime to the farmers. That's not where the value is. The farmers will be able to take care of themselves. Population pressure, rising incomes. They're not out of business, and they won't be out of business. But they, as long as they're allowed to hold to ransom the other things that really need attending to, where the true value is created, I think the WTO is going to stay stuck.
I tried to anticipate that criticism, and I frankly have some of the similar concerns. But, you know, it's one of the prices of imperfect democracy. I think virtually every one of our open societies, by any test objectively applied of one person, one vote, will find rural constituencies massively overrepresented in our legislatures. And if we have governments that are accountable, and as my former ambassador in Washington, Alan Gottlieb, famously used to say, there's only one US political party, actually, it's called the re-election party. And if that's who you have to respond to, we're going to be stuck with that disproportionately high priority being given to agriculture. But added to that, I have a great deal of genuine sympathy for developing countries, and I defer to our World Bank experts. But, you know, all the literature on green revolution and so on says everybody goes through a certain agriculture phase to get to a more industrialized economy. And if your share is dropping from 40, almost by half, and you're a net food importer, you want to do something about that, because it seems like it's actually a drain, not a contributor to your development. So let's face it, thanks to the Quad power, we did end up the Uruguay round with a fairly unbalanced set of obligations, frankly, where very little had to be done by the US and EU. And that's got to be redressed. And I'm not sure we've yet, I think the EU gets it. The US has a bit more domestic political difficulty. I'd love it to be true, let's put it that way, but I don't think I can get there with you.
Okay.
Jonathan, I really appreciate all the enlightening comments. In your speech, you have at least two places I count mentioned the relationship between energy, development, and trade. The first place is that trade and development come hand in hand, but trade has to be complemented with the other things. One of them is energy, the access to energy, the flow of energy around the world. The second part is actually the environmental impact or aspect of using the energy and in developing the trade together with the global economy. So I'm kind of wanting to hear a little bit more about you, from you on the insights concerning the trade importance or the trade as a part of the trade, energy as a part of the trade.
Well, let me quickly just sort of recapitulate what I tried to say on each front. If I've got business and I want to move to industrialization, I've got to have a reliable source of electricity or heating, depending on the climate, or what have you. Do I have A, access to sources of energy, and B, a pricing mechanism, and C, enough infrastructure, both in terms of human capital and physical capital, to provide a reliable source of energy? I'm not going to attract anybody to set up a factory if the blackouts occur very unpredictably once a day or twice a day. That means not only some stability in terms of imports that may be necessary, looking at indigenous sources, be they renewable or otherwise, and frankly, again, back to good economic governance. Don't unduly subsidize the energy that makes it impossible to actually produce more or generate more. Make sure that your cost structure and pricing structure for energy works, both for consumer and for industry. So that's on the first point. And that's, to me, also true of telecoms. People need to communicate. So what's your system for both land and wireless communication? And whose monopoly are you trying to protect, and how much access can you get with what kind of physical infrastructure that may be required to make that happen? On the second, all I was trying to say is we're beginning to see some very interesting jurisprudence as to how much you can understand the, quote, energy market as different markets. What the Ontario feed-in tariff case says, rightly or wrongly, and this is something for you folks to analyze, is the market for renewable energy electricity thus far is a different market than conventionally generated electricity, and thus can be regulated in a different way. They went on to say it doesn't justify local content requirements as to who participates in it. But is that right or wrong? As a matter of economics and as a matter of development strategy in an environment where you want cleaner energy. What it doesn't support is an arbitrary decision, and here I'll speak as a Canadian, proposed by the European Union under its clean energy objective, that it alone will decide what's clean and what's not based on the source of the energy and how it's generated, without reference to science.
We got the mic.
Yeah.
And after this, one last question, then we'll let Jonathan get to his dessert.
Thank you for the very clear presentation. I was struck by your relatively, sorry, throat's bad, optimistic stance on our chances for an investment agreement. And let me elaborate a little bit more on that. So one of the things we saw from the Uruguay round was the resistance to the TRIPS agreement. And, so we think that developing countries got something shoved down their throats a little bit, they swallowed it, and they haven't really digested it yet. TRIPS was implemented in India in 2005, and several other countries had longer periods and so on and so forth. So that makes me wonder how much appetite there is, and we already know their rate has increased in the system, in these countries for an agreement on investment. Particularly India, you mentioned that in your talk, has always opposed the Singapore issues. So that's one side of looking at it. But the other side of the issue, which I think gives me a little more optimism, and maybe this is your position, is that if we talked about multinational firms and partners in trade, but they're actually even more important in R&D. They conduct 90% of the world's R&D, okay? So they do a lot of trade, but they do more R&D than they do trade. So we've got the TRIPS agreement on board. Now, is that sort of the logic that you're thinking, that we got taken care of that, now maybe the agreement on investment will be a little bit more forthcoming?
No, slightly different. And of course, trade investment stats are misleading, because once you get the investment, in part it's to produce locally rather than having to export from abroad. It's deciding on, where's my next regional hub? Is it Malaysia or Thailand or Indonesia to serve ASEAN? Is it Peru or Colombia or Chile to serve Latin America? So to look at what they contribute to trade isn't so much the issue as what they're generating domestically, not only in terms of R&D, but job training, skills training, technology transfer, and so on. But that's not so much what I was getting at, although that is part of the appetite, it seems to me, because the conversations that are unfolding in UNCTAD seem more to be about, well, what do I have to do to attract my share? But rather, what you're beginning to see, thanks to the Extractive Industries Initiative, thanks to the pressure even from indigenous groups for more corporate social responsibility, on the environment, on natives, on whatever's happening locally, is almost the new version of what was debated in the 80s under restrictive business practices, which is an investment discussion today would be about the rights of the host state too, to demand that social responsibility, to insist on good corporate citizenship locally, to contribute. You've got the South African mining law as an interesting example, and so on. So it becomes more balanced discussion that could unfold. I didn't mean to imply that, all right, we have a market access package in 2014, let's jump to MAI 2, but rather simply that if we get through that market access package and we say we finished Doha, the door is then open to have quite an open agenda for issues that need to be addressed by both North and South in this century. And frankly, we're going to get there one way or the other, because if you want to take the doomsday scenario, if I can put it that way, that somehow we fail in Geneva, and in the meantime TPP and TTIP and RCEP and Mercosur gets rejuvenated, all sort of come together. Well, sooner or later, and probably sooner rather than later, the businesses that are multinational are going to say, I'm not going to change my production line just to fit one or another of these mega regional rules of origin. I want one set of rules, for God's sakes. I'm global, that's how I operate. So the agenda still comes back to Geneva, but it's more for the lawyers than the economists at that point, because then you say, well, how do I stitch together into an overarching whole these major blocks, rather than having to negotiate each issue anew? So one way or the other, you're still back to a global foundational framework, it seems to me. I think we have Judith.
Judith is the last one.
Oh, Judith.
So, okay. I just want because that's of course my nature. So you gave a really nice rendition of the WTO in a really traditional way, without seeing what I would say is the most fundamental things that actually Kamal pointed out this morning. Since 2000, there have been fundamental shifts in the world economy, not just in terms of relative power, but as Picardy in his recent book that everyone is reading now has shown, there's a fundamental change in income distribution within the developed as well as the developing world. This sort of shift in income distribution has profound implications for the political support for trade, for how things are going to look in the next 30 years. The WTO cannot just say, it's the same old business as before, we're going to get people together, their interests are going to align. It's just, it's just not that world anymore. And I think if the WTO is going to get ahead of this, they have to be thinking of new kinds of coalitions and also fundamentally asking questions about, like you said something like, the US still hasn't gotten it in terms of, agriculture in the developing world. Well, they haven't gotten it not just because of electoral politics, because they themselves, there's something happening in this country having to do with middle income stagnation, which means that for a whole variety of people, the whole notion of trade is looking really different than it looked in the years before 2000. Let's sort of take Kamal's distribution. In that world, there was coalitions of the willing all throughout the world. Now you have few coalitions of the willing. What you have is a lot of people who think they're no longer making it in the world that was created in that first post-war period. And so it's hard for me, and listen, it sounds optimistic, but it's totally like not looking at where the world's going. So that's my pessimistic version of a very good presentation.
But then I probably failed to communicate effectively, because what I tried to say is I fully agree, and I, among many, are quite sensitive to the distributional dimensions. Go back to one of my great mentors, Sylvia Austri, who was of the GATT era, and she basically helped to describe the GATT as a system friction reducer. In the post-war world, all we set up was a system to regulate how to reduce mismatches at the border. What goes on inside is your sovereign prerogative. WTO and the GATT never purported to reach beyond very much, other than Article 10 on transparency. The UN, similarly, that which is within domestic jurisdiction has the right of non-interference, right? And that's been a bit flexible. Through successive rounds of tariff reduction, we've gradually moved beyond the border to certain domestic aspects. But frankly, in regulating competition between producers, not producer-consumer even, we've never been given the mandate to get at distributional aspects within a country. What I've tried to emphasize is that's part of the structural reform and the economic governance that needs to accompany, that needs to come from other sources. And that's only going to happen if we get Geneva to work in sync with those who are responsible for the development agenda. Frankly, it's another dimension of piling on to the WTO labor, environment, income equality, that was never intended to all belong to the WTO. It's one of the perverse results of the dispute settlement system being so effective, because it's the only place that has actually gotten things done, at least that's been visible enough to people. So I've tried, frankly, in the course of my presentation, to fully acknowledge the reality that this is ultimately about jobs, and this is ultimately about making the pie bigger that can then be distributed in a more socially responsible way within each society. But that requires better alignment among those institutions and agencies and donors that are supposedly responsible for help making that happen. So we don't disagree as much as you want to make out.
Jonathan, I'd love to thank you, but I turn it over to Nick for that.
Yeah, all I have to do is reach under here and get out the memento of your visit Come again, we'll do better. But we're very grateful to you,
Thank you
Jonathan.
so
This
much.
is the second time we've had you with us. As I said, I can't wait for the next time.
You're
Thank you
very,
very
very
much. Thank you very much.